That's just yet, Derek.
Sorry. How does that look?
There we go. Yeah, looks good.
All right. Okay, good to go. So good afternoon, everyone. Thanks a lot for joining this breakout group. We'll be discussing some of the key areas of interest for quantifying the GHG impacts of teleworking. And I'll be talking about a couple of projects that my organization, Pollution Probe, has been involved in, which kind of delves into this emerging topic, which has, I think we can all agree, pretty big implications for GHG emissions. So to start off, just a few high-level points about Pollution Probe. We're one of not only Canada's oldest environmental NGOs, but one of the oldest in the world. We were established back in 1969 by faculty and students at the University of Toronto. And our transportation program has been working on decarbonizing Canada's transportation sector for over 20 years. We work with a really wide variety of public and private sector stakeholders, a few of which are profiled on the screen here. And currently we have 4 program areas that we work in at Pollution Probe, and those are transportation, energy, circular economy, and water. So just to dig into a few trends in teleworking, we're all very much aware that the COVID-19 pandemic, which took effect about a year and a half ago now, it really upended transportation networks around the world as well as workplace practices. And for example, in Canada, within the span of a couple months in early 2020, we saw remote working go from roughly 4% of Canadian workers to upwards of 40%. So a tenfold increase there, pretty significant. And everything indicates that this trend is expected to continue, and that, as I said, it will have major implications for GHG emissions, especially for transportation and buildings, which are, for most Canadian cities, the 2 biggest areas of GHG emissions. So some of the key areas within the teleworking trend that we're looking at are noted on this slide. The first of which is commuting frequency and modal choice. So everyone knows that transit ridership numbers plummeted following the outbreak last year. In Canadian cities and major cities around the world, these numbers fell by roughly, or between 60 and 90% from their previous levels. And in Toronto, for example, which saw roughly a 90% drop in transit usage last year, Toronto is still about 40% below its previous averages in terms of transit ridership. And also a trend in Canadian cities is that many urban residents view privately owned vehicles as the safest mode of travel. And as a result, car ownership in Canadian cities on a per household basis tends to be, or seems to be, rising. And this is a really worrisome trend, considering the fact that household car ownership levels across Canada, in cities at least, has been declining for the better part of the past 20 years. So this would have serious GHG implications. Another key trend to note in terms of modal choice is that active transportation has been really increasing in popularity. And as a result, cities they have been scrambling for over a year now to better provide active transportation infrastructure to residents. Another key area of impact is home versus office energy usage. So there are concerns that telework will cause home energy usage to increase above and beyond the decreases that we're seeing from office energy usage. That's the crux of that point there. Another area is that the frequency of dedicated non-work related trips over the course of any given day may increase in a teleworking model. So essentially, people used to add a lot of trips onto their commutes, right? Whether it be running errands, conducting social visits, things like that, people would kind of tack onto their commutes as opposed to, come home from work and then go out and conduct errands. So if people working at home are conducting a higher number of short trips as opposed to a lower number of long trips, that could have some concerning implications for GHG emissions. And likewise, if these trips are done outside of rush hours, then the GHG impacts will be lower. But as with all trips, what really matters the most here is the distance, the frequency of the trips, and the modes of trips. So if people are running errands when they're working at home using active transit, obviously that's not going to have a GHG impact. But if they're using their cars, privately owned vehicles, that's going to have a bigger impact. The last area here I wanted to flag is a point that's currently under-researched, but a lot of people are tracking developments in this space closely, and that's the relocation of households to more GHG-intensive areas. So evidence is suggesting that there is a bit of a relocation happening from urban cores to less densely populated suburbs or rural areas. And that's problematic because these types of areas tend to have bigger households in general, like bigger homes, which are more energy intensive. And the commutes in these areas tend to be much longer. And also a higher share of trips in rural and suburban areas tend to be completed using privately owned cars, which has major GHG implications. So to get to the bottom of some of these areas, the City of Edmonton conducted a study earlier this year to look at the GHG emissions impacts from reduced commuting from City of Edmonton staff. So much of the office-based staff at the city shifted to teleworking soon after the outbreak. And so Edmonton wanted to kind of assess and get a handle on the GHG impacts of this. The key finding here is that for each city staff member that teleworked for 3 or more days each week, they reduced their annual transportation carbon footprint by roughly 1.1 tons. And so that has big implications in cities like Toronto, which has over 20,000 office-based staff. If each of those staff members could telework and reduce their commuting footprint by upwards of a ton, that would have major GHG implications. However, there are some indirect impacts as well that could negate benefits from reduced commuting. A few of these are noted on the slide here. The biggest one is, as I mentioned on the last slide, an increase in daily non-work related travel. So if people are conducting a higher frequency of trips using highly carbon intensive modes like cars while they're teleworking, then that could negate the benefits of reduced commuting by upwards of 25%. Another key area is an increase in home energy usage, which is kind of intuitive. If people are working from home all the time, they'll likely have their thermostats up a little higher in the winter months and a little lower in the summer months, assuming people actually adjust their thermostats when they go to work, which may be a big assumption. And that could negate upwards of 8% of the benefits from reduced commuting. Another area which has been flagged by some stakeholders, but which we didn't find had a significant impact, was an increase in video conferencing. So the City of Edmonton study and a couple others conducted in other parts of Canada have found that increased use of platforms like Zoom during the course of the workday doesn't have a significant carbon impact, fortunately. And on the flip side, there are some indirect impacts that can compound the benefits of reduced commuting and can add to them, such as decreased office energy usage. And this depends obviously on the workplace policies of a given employer, but the study found that decreased office energy usage could lead to 2% to over 100% of the benefits from reduced commuting. And just a quick note that the results of this study would differ a lot in an Ontario context, which Ontario has a much lower carbon intensity of its electricity grid, for one, and for two, a lot more commuters in the GTHA tend to use transit as opposed to single occupancy vehicles, as was the case in Edmonton. So just a couple of variables there that would change things a little bit. So moving on to the current study, Pollution Probe and a couple of the organizations that led the City of Edmonton study were recently tasked by the City of Toronto to lead a GHG reduction assessment from Toronto's telework policies. We're working with the Energy and Environment Division at the city, and specifically the Smart Commute, Modern TO, and Transform TO programs. Just a quick blurb about each of these programs. So Smart Commute provides services for city staff as well as local businesses and neighboring municipalities to encourage low carbon commuting. Modern TO is developing a workplace modernization program for the city, and that will include telework policies and a decentralization of office space into community hubs or satellite offices. And Transform TO is the city's climate action strategy, and it's aiming at net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And it includes a lot of transportation and building decarbonization targets. So those are the three groups we're working with at the city primarily. And like the Edmonton study, a major focus of our efforts here will be to deliver a staff survey. And this will determine the past and anticipated commuting frequency, modes, and distances of city staff. And the Toronto study, unlike Edmonton, will also assess the GHG impacts from building energy usage. So we'll be asking people in the survey about their home energy usage habits, and we'll be collecting data on energy usage from the city for its office spaces. And the study outputs will include best practice guides for minimizing GHG impacts from teleworking, both for individuals and organizations, both the city and its partner organizations. So here's a high-level schematic of our methodology for quantifying the GHG impacts. And this one is focused explicitly on commuting impacts. We will be developing a separate one for office energy usage and home energy usage. But there are 3 points of data gathering that will take place. They're indicated by the gray boxes. And the first one, employee characterization, relates to the total number of employees participating in telework. And it captures the 3 core variables that I mentioned before, which are the frequency, the distance in kilometers, and the mode of the typical commutes that city employees use. And this data will be derived from our survey, our staff survey. Another area of data gathering will be to capture the emissions intensity of different commuting modes. And this simply encompasses the GHG intensity of the various modes in a given area. So we'll be looking at modes like single occupancy vehicle, cars, light trucks, carpooling or drop-offs, transit, which will break down into separate modes like bus, subway, LRT, etc. We'll also be looking at micromobility, which is a new type of mode which is rapidly increasing in popularity. These are electric bikes, electric scooters, skateboards, etc. And of course, we'll look at active transportation, the lowest carbon mode possible, which is cycling and walking. And then the last area we'll be gathering data in is the expected policy uptake area. So this is simply the number of employees participating and how often on a weekly basis they'll be teleworking. And the Edmonton study did not factor in indirect impacts, but like I said, the Toronto study will be looking at impacts from building energy usage as well. So that's it for the background on the Edmonton and Toronto studies. Just a quick note that the Toronto study just kicked off a couple of weeks ago and is scheduled to wrap up in May of next year, May 2022. So stay tuned for findings on that. And now I think what we're going to do is jump into the discussion questions. Obviously, if anyone has questions for me about this work or about some of our preliminary findings, feel free to jump in with those as well. But
Yeah, so Derek, maybe we'll pause just for a second too before get diving into the discussion question. Just see if anyone does have any questions based on what you presented in the two studies.
Sure thing.
I just saw a hand go up there. What was it? Oh, I just missed it. But jump in. Feel free to unmute yourself and.
Thanks, Derek, for this. I have to leave in 2 minutes, but I just want to quickly reflect on, I know we're not getting into discussion questions, but I am from your region, and we were doing our community energy plan like all throughout last and early this year. And this was definitely a question because when we started doing the energy plan, we were using data pre-COVID, like pre-pandemic, and then we were wondering how it's going to affect our greenhouse gas emission, the data that we're inputting into this, especially with the telework. So it was good to see this, but of course, we really didn't have the time or the data to really dwell into this, and it's still early days with understanding how telework is going to be. But it was interesting to see this, and maybe as we do like future iterations of our energy plan, maybe some of this, by then there will be more data for us to work with this.
Yeah, most definitely. Thanks for the comments and the support. We agree it's a really important areas for cities and municipalities to be looking at. And just so you know, the results from this project will be made public, and we will be capturing the methodology that we use in the end of project report. And the City of Toronto does plan to share this broadly with its neighboring municipalities like York Region and its broader network of businesses and municipalities from across the country. And we hope this work really inspires and serves as a guide to other municipalities to lead similar initiatives because of the huge potential implications of teleworking on GHG emissions. And like I said, we feel this is a trend that's only going to grow, and it should be something that cities begin to track and actively manage as they move forward.
Thank you, and I will leave. I apologize for having for another meeting.
Sure thing, and my contact information is on the last slide, which I'll just show now, in case you wanted to get in touch with any questions or comments on our work.
All right, I will. I have noted that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Derek, I wonder, just kind of on that note too, in terms of like sources of the data, and I know obviously things like the survey, that's specific to the staff, but are there other sources that you've been using that, if I don't know if it's MTO or other, higher levels of data that could be accessed and not just related to the City of Toronto?
Yeah, most definitely. So we're looking at primarily NRKN data, which breaks down the GHG intensity of different modes of transport in different parts of the country. We'll be using primarily that federal government data to approximate the GHG intensity of different transit modes in the GTHA, for example. We'll also be making some assumptions based on what we know about Toronto. We will likely be reaching out to MTO as they're the real keepers of the keys in terms of the transportation data and vehicle registrations and things like that in the GTHA for the province. So all of that methodology and our sources of data will be cataloged and noted in our findings. I see there's a question from Alex. Feel free to jump in and fire away.
Thanks, Derek. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
So I have, I'm not sure if they're really questions, but more observations or comments. So I'm coming to you from Guelph, and three sort of comments that I would make that may provide you with some guidance regarding how I would like to be able to use the results of a study like this. The first is that Guelph is a net inbound commuter community. So in that respect, we have that in common with Toronto, where more commuters come in than leave. In our case, they tend to be, and this actually may be a similar, but just on a very much smaller scale, the people commuting into Guelph tend to be coming from very small communities that are not served by transit. So single passenger vehicle is pretty much their only option. So that's one part of the picture. The second part is that we have considerably higher than the provincial average uptake of electric vehicles. So I believe it was 17% higher than the provincial average for battery electric vehicles, and an even higher figure for plug-in hybrids. So I think one of the question marks that is coming out to my mind is when we look at these various negative implications of telework, how many of them would be mitigated by the transition to electric vehicles? Now, you also mentioned about active transportation. We've got a very well-developed and still developing active transportation infrastructure, and a very active community NGO that is promoting uptake of active transportation. So that's all another part of the story as well. And then there was a third point that I wanted to kind of throw out there, and oh yeah, I guess the fact is, like, we've received funding from the federal and provincial governments for our initiative to adopt electric buses, and I suppose one question that is likely to come up is that going to be money well spent if ridership is dropping? Is there a way to kind of pull that out of the fire and ensure that the full range of benefits, environmental benefits, are achieved, in spite of the fact that we're seeing this shift where more people are getting a little leery about transit and the close proximity to other people who may or may not be vaccinated, may or may not be wearing masks or wearing them properly, and so forth.
Yeah, excellent points all around, Alex, and thanks for bringing those up. Pollution Probe actually led a project last year for NRCan on the impacts of the pandemic on different modes of transport, such as public transit. Transit was a huge focus of that work. And to your point about the rising trend of electric buses, which we're very much in favor of, obviously, at Pollution Probe, most of my work focuses on electric vehicles in general. I would suggest you look into trends like transit on demand, or micro-mobility, as we mentioned. But transit on demand is a really interesting emerging trend, especially for municipalities like Guelph, that transit ridership will be concentrated to a great deal during rush hours, and then off-peak, the ridership numbers and vehicle occupancy levels really fall off dramatically. So when that happens with diesel-powered buses, for example, when occupancy rates drop during evenings, weekends, etc., the average GHG intensity per rider skyrockets. It can even be worse than driving a privately owned car or truck. And I'm sure you've seen cases where a big urban diesel bus is carrying around 2 or 3 riders. You can imagine what the GHG intensity of each of those riders is. So transit on demand pilots are being led throughout Canada now. They actually took off during the pandemic. You might want to look into the city of Belleville. They're doing a really interesting pilot, and they reported, I forget the exact numbers, but I think the GHG intensity of transit operations per rider decreased by something like 75% when they launched their transit on demand pilot last year, and the ridership satisfaction actually improved. The level of service, they were able to serve the same number of riders with far fewer buses and on far fewer routes, just by kind of adjusting. So transit on demand generally uses smaller vehicles, and in most cases it will use apps to pick up passengers wherever they happen to be within a given area that's within the route's service area. And they'll often pick up passengers when they ask for a pickup via an app, and then they'll drop them off, roughly in the vicinity of where they're going, if not at the door of where they're going. So These are also being piloted in places like Calgary and larger municipalities as well. And all indicators point to a lot of GHG savings. So even with electric or diesel buses, there's significant GHG benefits there. And another point I would raise on transit is that vehicle downsizing or right sizing, as we refer to it, is really important. And so, you know, that cities like Guelph may not want to run their full-length buses during off-peak hours. They may want to switch to even like shuttle buses or just smaller vehicles in general. And on your point on EVs, that's a really good one in terms of commuting modes. In our survey for the City of Toronto, we're treating EVs as a distinct mode in and of itself, and we're including plug-in hybrid electrics as well. So we're including that as a separate mode because we realize the GHG intensity of using an EV is pretty low in Ontario. Like our grid is, you know, around 93% emissions free in Ontario. So using an EV in a province like this is it's a pretty clear win for the environment. So good catch.
You also tend to charge up at night when the grid is clean.
Exactly. Yeah.
One other side note, I'm wondering about potentially enhancing the business case for electric buses. If they're not going to be, if we're talking about full-side buses and they're not going to be run off peak periods, there is still a value that can be derived from those devices, those vehicles, by offering them up as a grid resource and being able to deal with like as an energy storage device if you have bidirectional charging. So it seems to me that there might be an opportunity there with the appropriate rate structures in place to enhance the business case for those vehicles and to offer them up as an asset for peak shaving on the grid.
Most definitely, and that's another key emerging issue that we track very closely at Pollution Probe is vehicle to grid, vehicle to everything technologies, and the slow rollout of those technologies, which is kind of accelerating now. Finally, it used to be just certain automakers would make their vehicles work with bidirectional charging, like Nissan was a pioneer, Mitsubishi also, but now you're seeing automakers like Ford with the F-150 Lightning provide bidirectional capabilities there. So really exciting to see. And just a couple of quick points. So we're huge proponents of vehicle to grid, but with city buses, a couple of things. It may be best for them to charge slowly overnight, like level 2 charging as opposed to DC fast charging, just because the charging infrastructure is cheaper and the demand on the grid would be a bit lessened. So that may limit their potential in a vehicle to grid application. And also there's battery degradation issues that need to be considered with vehicle to grid technologies. If you're constantly charging and discharging these vehicle batteries on a daily basis, it could lead to degradation that could, you know, hurt the overall health of the asset over time. But overall, a good idea. And sorry, I just realized we have a few minutes left only to dig into our discussion questions, but maybe I'll just go back to them quickly in case anyone wants to chime in. So have any of your organizations attempted to quantify emissions from telework? And if so, did you experience any challenges that you think are worthy of sharing? And we've already heard a bit from York Region and Guelph, but if no one has any burning thoughts on this one, maybe we'll move to the next. So the next one is kind of a brainstorming exercise. What types of best practices could employers use to reduce the carbon intensity of their operations while maintaining productivity and job satisfaction? So we're looking at best practices, things like flex hours for staff, so that they don't, when they do commute, they're not commuting during rush hours, flex space in offices, satellite offices. If anyone has any ideas in this area, feel free to jump in here.
I think on this one, it certainly will be interesting to see large employers. I mean, and, you know, like the City of Toronto, say, that has a large, you know, building portfolio across the city, whether they're able to better leverage some of those spaces for things like satellite offices and other private companies that may have, an interest in all of a sudden, not necessarily relocating to other communities and cities, but having those satellite spaces. I think, yeah, that could certainly, and then spread out the other benefits of just having employers in those places where they live, and sort of the economic and spin-off benefits of that. I think that'll be a really interesting trend to watch.
I agree. And just a quick background on the city's tentative plans on that. So they have a couple dozen major office spaces in Toronto where most of the office-based staff flock to every day, or they did before the pandemic. They're thinking about closing those and opening up 600 satellite offices so city staff can work at whatever satellite location is closest to where they live, to reduce their commute and enhance overall job satisfaction as well. Pretty cool program, and that's the modern TO program.
Right. So
it looks like we're getting booted here. Do we have time to?
The countdown is officially on at 50 seconds.
Okay.
Yeah.
So last discussion question here. Teleworking is a trend that's not going anywhere. So this is on the relocation point. So what, if any, types of population shifts might we expect? Exoduses from major urban cities or major urban cores to suburbs and small towns. And how might these impact society-wide GHG emissions? Any thoughts on that point?
And just very briefly, one thing that we're definitely seeing is that the real estate market is being impacted. And so there's some serious gentrification happening, and it's becoming less and less affordable for people that are of moderate means to be able to purchase the home of their dreams here in Guelph. So I think that's something to consider. And I've heard that